The monitors were screaming. Not one, not two. Every single machine in room 412 was losing its mind at the same moment, and the hallway outside had turned into a war zone of white coats and rubber-soled shoes and voices climbing over each other trying to be heard. BP is crashing, 70 over 40 and dropping. Where is Dr. Harmon? Someone get Harmon. He's in surgery, he's not coming. And right there, standing at the edge of that chaos, was a woman nobody in that hospital had thought twice about. She was holding a cup of coffee that had gone cold an hour ago. She hadn't taken a single sip. Her eyes were moving in a pattern that nobody in that hallway would have recognized, scanning left, scanning right, tracking every person, every monitor, every exit, every face. Not with panic, not with confusion, with calculation. Her name badge said, Maya Reeves, RN, Cardiac Step-Down Unit. She was a nurse, a floor nurse, the kind of person who takes vitals, adjusts 4 drips, answers call lights, and smiles through 12-hour shifts. The kind of person that administrators walk past without making eye contact. The kind of person that certain doctors address by pointing rather than by name. Nobody was looking at her right now. They were looking at the man dying in that room. His name was Colonel James Whitfield, 71 years old, retired, admitted 3 days ago with what the attending physician had confidently called a manageable cardiac event. He had a daughter who visited every evening at 6. He had a photograph of a brown Labrador on his bedside table. He had told Maya, during her 3 a.m. rounds 2 nights ago, that the dog's name was Sergeant. He had laughed when he said it. A deep, weathered laugh. He wasn't laughing now. The crash cart was being wheeled in. A resident Maya had never seen before. Young, trembling slightly, the kind of trembling that hands do when the brain knows something is wrong, but the training hasn't caught up yet, was calling out orders that 2 nurses were already second-guessing with their eyes. Maya set down her coffee. She moved toward the door of room 412. And that's when the arm came out. Broad, firm, belonging to charge nurse Daniel Precht, who had been running this floor for 11 years and who had, in those 11 years, developed a very specific talent for deciding who belonged where. Step back, Reeves. This isn't your patient. She looked at the arm. Then she looked at Daniel. I know this patient, she said. You're not his assigned nurse. Step back. Inside the room, the resident was calling for epinephrine. Someone was saying the dosage wrong. Maya heard it. She heard it the way a musician hears a wrong note in a crowded room. Instantly, completely, without effort. Daniel. I said step back. She looked past him, through the glass, at the man in the bed whose face was the color of old ash, whose hands were gripping the rails with the specific grip of someone who had been trained, somewhere in their life, never to let go. She knew that grip. She had been trained that way too. And she knew, with the cold, absolute certainty of someone who has watched the line between life and death up close, that if she stepped back right now, Colonel James Whitfield was not going to make it through the next 4 minutes. She didn't step back. Instead, she leaned forward and said something to Daniel Precht. 2 words. Quiet. Calm. Words that made the color drain from his face faster than anything happening on the other side of that glass. He dropped his arm. He stepped aside. And Maya Reeves walked into that room like she owned the floor, the hospital, and every secret buried beneath it. What were those 2 words? And who, exactly, was this woman that a single sentence stopped a man cold? Stay with me, because nothing about Maya Reeves is what it appears to be. 3 weeks earlier, Maya Reeves had started her shift the way she always did. 45 minutes early. Not because the hospital required it. Not because she was trying to impress anyone. She arrived early because she had a system. And her system required 45 minutes of overlap with the night nurse to walk every room, read every chart update, and build what she privately called her picture. A complete tactical map of every patient on the floor, their status, their trajectory, their risks. She never wrote this picture down. She held it entirely in her head. The night nurses had noticed, in the way that people who work quiet hours notice things. One of them, a gentle Haitian man named Laurent who had been a nurse for 22 years, had once asked her about it. You memorize all of it? He'd said, watching her flip through charts without writing a single note. I retain what's important, she'd said. That's a lot of important. She had smiled and moved to the next room. Laurent had watched her go. He'd worked with hundreds of nurses over 2 decades. He didn't know exactly what it was about Maya Reeves that made the hair on the back of his neck stand up, not in a bad way, but in the way it does when you're in the presence of someone operating on a different frequency than everyone else. She was 38 years old and she looked, depending on the moment, either younger than that or ageless in a way that was hard to define. Medium height. Dark hair kept in a neat braid that never seemed to get messy, even at hour 11 of a 12-hour shift. Hands that were always steady. Eyes that were always moving. She had arrived at St. Clement's Medical Center 14 months ago with a resume that was solid but unremarkable. 5 years at a cardiac unit in Tucson. 2 years before that at a trauma center in San Diego. Clean record. Excellent references. Nothing that would make anyone look twice. The small things were harder to explain away. Like the fact that she had once, during a code in the hallway, taken over chest compressions from a 6-foot resident without asking permission and performed them with a mechanical precision. Perfect rate, perfect depth, zero fatigue, for 11 straight minutes until the team was ready. The resident had stood there rubbing his hands, which had actually begun to shake after 4 minutes. Hers had not. Like the fact that every single time a patient's condition changed, not after the monitor alarmed, but before, sometimes 20 minutes before, Maya Reeves seemed to already be standing outside their door. Like the fact that she was the only nurse on the floor who never, not once, flinched at the sound of a code alarm. Everyone else, even the veterans, had a half-second response. A small jump, the body betraying the mind. Maya's body never betrayed her. Like the fact that on the morning a man had come into the unit visiting a family member and had been, within 30 seconds of Maya seeing him across the nurse's station, quietly escorted by security out of the building, because Maya had calmly picked up the phone, called the desk, and said 3 specific words that had resulted in 2 security guards appearing in under 90 seconds. Nobody asked her how she'd known the man was a problem. She hadn't explained. And like the thing that her colleague, a young nurse named Priya, had noticed 6 months ago and hadn't quite been able to shake since. Priya had been in the break room, complaining about a difficult patient, the kind of complaint that nurses make privately, harmlessly, to decompress. Routine. Maya had been sitting across from her eating a sandwich. And Priya had made a joke. A dark one. The kind that medical workers make because the alternative is crying. And Maya had laughed. Genuinely. Warmly. But for 1 fraction of a second before the laugh. A fraction of a second that Priya had caught only because she happened to be looking directly at Maya's face. There had been something else. Not sadness, exactly. More like recognition. The specific recognition of someone who has seen the thing behind the joke in real life. Who knows that the punchline isn't actually funny because they were there when it wasn't funny. Who carry something heavy that they have learned, through long practice, to carry without showing. Priya had never mentioned it. But she had never quite forgotten it either. Maya Reeves was a nurse. That much was true. Everything else was a question that nobody on that floor had thought to ask. Until now. St. Clement's Medical Center sat in the middle of a mid-sized Ohio city that had once had money and was now in the specific process of remembering that it used to. The hospital was real enough, solid brick, 5 floors, a cardiac unit that handled more volume than its size should have allowed because it was the only serious option within 40 miles. The cardiac step-down unit, the floor between the ICU and the regular ward, where patients were stable but not safe, ran on a specific social hierarchy that had nothing to do with the organizational chart. At the top, officially, Dr. Raymond Harmon, the attending cardiologist. Mid-50s. Well-dressed in the way that men who are aware of their own competence tend to be. He had a habit of addressing nurses by the first letter of their last name, which he appeared to believe was efficient rather than dismissive. He called Maya R for the first 3 weeks until she had looked at him from across a patient's bed and said, with absolute pleasantness, "It's Reeves." Or Maya. Either works. He had called her Reeves since then. She counted that as a win. Below Harmon, unofficially but powerfully, Daniel Precht. Charge nurse. The man who controlled the schedule, mediated the conflicts, absorbed the pressure from above and distributed it downward with the practiced efficiency of someone who had been doing it so long he no longer noticed he was doing it. Daniel was not a bad man. That was the important thing to understand about him. He was tired, overworked, understaffed, and operating a floor that ran at 110% capacity on a 100% budget. He had 3 nurses out this month, 1 on maternity leave, 1 recovering from surgery, 1 who had simply stopped showing up. He was doing math every single shift that didn't add up, and the pressure of that math had calcified into a management style that was, in the most accurate word, rigid. He ran his floor by the rules because the rules were the only thing holding the floor together. He did not like exceptions. He did not like surprises. And he had not, from the beginning, known what to make of Maya Reeves. The conflict had started small. It always does. 6 weeks after Maya arrived, she had reordered a patient's medications, not changed the order, reordered the timing, because she had noticed that the patient was experiencing peak discomfort during the window between doses that the current schedule created. She had documented everything. She had left a note for the physician. She had done it correctly. Daniel had called her into the supply room and told her, in a tone that was professional on the surface and something else underneath, that nurses on his floor did not modify physician orders without explicit verbal confirmation first. I didn't modify, she'd said. I optimized the window. Same thing. It isn't. On my floor it is. She had looked at him for a moment. Not defiantly. Not with anger. With the specific patience of someone who has had this particular conversation, or a version of it, many times before. Understood, she had said. And she had walked out. That had bothered Daniel more than an argument would have. The other doctors were a mixed portrait. Dr. Singh, the overnight cardiologist, treated the nursing staff with genuine respect and had, within a week of Maya's arrival, started asking for her input during rounds in a way that he didn't with the other nurses. Dr. Chun, the young second-year resident, was terrified of Maya in the specific way that intelligent people are terrified of someone who is clearly more competent than they are while technically being their subordinate. Among the nurses, there were two camps. The camp that found Maya fascinating, which included Priya and Lauren, and the camp that found her unsettling, which included a veteran nurse named Carolyn who had been on this floor for 15 years and who had, 15 years ago, established an equilibrium of how things were done and who was who and what mattered and what didn't. Maya disrupted that equilibrium simply by existing. It wasn't anything she said. Carolyn would have preferred it if it was something she said. She could have addressed that. It was more that Maya seemed to operate by an internal compass that didn't reference the same magnetic north as everyone else's. She made decisions calmly and quickly. She prioritized without discussion. She never looked uncertain. She makes me feel like I'm in a simulation, Carolyn had told Priya in the break room once. Like she's the only real person and the rest of us are NPCs. Priya had laughed. But she had also, privately, understood exactly what Carolyn meant. The moment that crystallized everything had happened 4 weeks ago. A family member, a son visiting his father in room 408, had become irate. Loudly, escalatingly irate. The kind of irate that starts as frustration and climbs, rung by rung, towards something that required intervention. Daniel was dealing with a crisis down the hall. The security desk was 1 floor away. Maya stepped in front of the man. She didn't call for backup. She didn't raise her voice. She stood in the hallway in her scrubs with her hands loose at her sides, and she looked at this large, furious man and said something to him. Quietly, so no one else could hear. And within 45 seconds, he was sitting in a chair, head in his hands, crying rather than shouting. Nobody had seen anything quite like it. Nobody asked her what she'd said. She returned to her chart. The floor had never felt entirely the same after that. Colonel James Whitfield arrived on a Tuesday. Maya was at the nurse's station when the transport team wheeled him in from the cardiac catheterization lab, and she did something that nobody noticed, but that would have meant something to the right observer. She stood up. Not out of protocol. Not because there was anything to do yet. She stood up, and her eyes tracked him from the elevator doors to room 412, and she stayed standing for 4 full seconds after the transport team passed before she sat back down and returned to her charting. Priya was sitting next to her. You know him? Priya asked, because she had noticed the standing. No, Maya said. And that was true. She didn't know Colonel James Whitfield. But she knew what he was. She had clocked it the moment the transport doors opened. The posture that doesn't fully leave a person even when they're sick, even when they're in a hospital gown, even when they're 71 years old and their heart is stuttering. The way he'd tracked the room as they wheeled him in. The way his eyes had moved to every doorway, every face, every potential variable. The way he'd looked at Maya when their eyes met for a single second. Not the look a patient gives a nurse. Something else. Something brief and specific. Recognition. She had looked away first. Deliberately. And she had returned to her chart. By day 2, she had found small reasons to be near his room. This was the first thing the other nurses would later, in retrospect, find strange. Maya's assigned patients were at the other end of the hall. There was no clinical reason for her to pass room 412 as often as she did. But she passed it, and each time she did, she slowed for exactly 1 step. Long enough to glance through the glass. Long enough to see him, to observe him, to take a reading. His daughter came every evening at 6, as promised. Her name was Elaine, late 30s, worried eyes, The particular kind of composure that people who love strong people develop because they understand that strength requires them to be strong too. She sat at his bedside and talked to him with a deliberate lightness that Maya recognized as practiced bravery. On day 2, at 7:15, after Elaine had left, Maya was passing the room and she heard something. She stopped. She went to the door and looked through the glass. Colonel Whitfield was lying in his bed with his eyes on the ceiling, and he was doing something with his right hand. Not trembling, not reaching, something precise, something deliberate. His fingers were moving in a pattern. Small, controlled, tapping. Maya stood at that glass for 6 seconds. Then she moved on. The second incident happened on the morning of day 3. Dr. Chun was doing morning rounds, and he had entered room 412 and was running through the routine questions. Pain level, sleep quality, any new symptoms. And Colonel Whitfield was answering in the flat, minimal way of someone who has been medically assessed enough times in their life to view it as a formality. Maya was charting outside the door. She heard Dr. Chen ask about the nitroglycerin the patient had been given overnight. She heard Colonel Whitfield say, the third dose felt different from the first 2. She heard Dr. Chen say, that's normal. The body adjusts. She heard the conversation move on. She sat very still for a moment. Then she pulled up his medication record on her terminal. She read through the overnight nursing notes. She read through them twice. The third dose had been administered by a float nurse covering a gap shift. The documentation was complete. Everything looked correct on paper. Maya stared at the screen. She went to the supply room, and she found the charge log for that medication batch, and she cross-referenced it with 2 other patients who'd received the same batch overnight. She stood in that supply room for 3 minutes, completely still, running something through her head. Then she closed the log, returned it to its place, and walked back to the station. She didn't raise an alarm. She didn't go to Daniel. She didn't call Dr. Chen back. She sat down, pulled up her own charting, and she increased the frequency of her informal monitoring of room 412 from every 40 minutes to every 20. Priya noticed. You're burning a hole in that window, she said at lunch. Is something wrong with the colonel? Maya peeled open her yogurt. I'm watching. For what? She looked at Priya with a calm that was almost eerie. I'll know it when I see it. The third incident came that afternoon, and it was the one that should have made everyone pay attention. Dr. Harmon swept through on his afternoon round. He swept. That was the accurate verb. Stethoscope around his neck like a finishing accessory. Chart in hand. 3 seconds per notation. And he emerged from room 412 with the expression of a man who has confirmed what he already believed. Stable, he announced to no one in particular. We'll look at discharge planning for Thursday. Maya was standing 12 feet away. His apical pulse has been irregular in the 6 o'clock hour, she said. Harmon looked at her. The look he gave people when they surprised him with information he hadn't asked for. The monitor shows normal sinus. For 23 hours out of 24. The irregularity is brief. 11 to 13 minutes. It's happened both evenings. He stared at her. That's a very specific observation for a patient who isn't yours. I documented it, she said. It's in the supplemental notes. He looked at his tablet. He found the notes. He looked at them for a long moment. He looked back at her. Continue monitoring, he said. And he swept on. Daniel had watched the entire exchange from the station. He said nothing, but his jaw had tightened. And after Harmon left, he pulled up the supplemental notes himself, and he read through them. And something behind his eyes shifted. Something between professional respect and something he wasn't ready to name. He glanced down the hall, toward room 412. He glanced at Maya. She was already looking at room 412. At 6:47 that evening, every monitor in room 412 began to scream. The first alarm sounded at 6:47. By 6:48, there were 4. By 6:49, every person on the cardiac step-down unit who was not directly responsible for another patient was either in room 412 or pressing toward the door of it. And the hallway had the specific, airless energy of controlled panic. That thin membrane between professional training and raw human fear that holds when everything works and tears when it doesn't. The resident on duty was Dr. Chun. He was 28 years old, and he had been practicing medicine for 14 months, and he was good. Genuinely good. The kind of good that would mature into excellent given time and experience. But time and experience are exactly what do not exist inside a 6-minute cardiac window. He moved to the bedside. He called for the crash cart. He read the monitors. Vitach, he said. We need to. Heart rate is 180 and climbing. A nurse called from the other side of the bed. Where's the crash cart? Coming. I need the crash cart now. The card appeared in the doorway, pushed by a unit aide who had the look of someone who hoped they would never be the one doing this. The defibrillator, the medications, the equipment laid out in the specific geometry of emergency intervention. Dr. Chun moved toward it with the posture of someone who has rehearsed this moment many times and is now discovering that rehearsal and reality are different countries. He called for amiodarone. He called for the correct dose. He began the calculation aloud. From the doorway, blocked now by Daniel's arm, where Maya stood with her hands loose at her sides, she watched his lips move. She heard the number. She closed her eyes for 1 second. The dose was not right. Not dramatically wrong. Not the kind of wrong that announces itself loudly. The kind of wrong that is almost right, that a tired resident with 14 months of experience and 6 minutes of window could arrive at completely honestly. The kind of wrong that, in this specific patient with this specific cardiac profile and this specific medication history she had spent 3 days memorizing, would not work. Worse than not work. Step back, Reeves, Daniel said. She looked at him. She looked at Colonel Whitfield. He was conscious. That was the remarkable thing. He was lying in that bed with his jaw set and his hands gripping the rails with that grip she had recognized on day one. And his eyes were open, and they found her in the doorway through the crowd of white coats, and they were the eyes of a man who has been in bad situations before and who knows, with animal clarity, that this one is going in a direction that the people in this room are not fully prepared for. His eyes held hers. And then, small, precise, deliberate, his right hand moved. 3 taps. Then 2. Then 3. On the bed rail. Maya stopped breathing for exactly 1 second. She knew that pattern. There was no version of her life in which she did not know that pattern. She looked at Daniel. And she said 2 words. Not loudly. Not with urgency. With the specific, flat authority of someone stating a fact that requires no emphasis because the weight of it does not need help. She said, Sierra Kilo. The color left Daniel's face. He had been a charge nurse for 11 years. He had worked in 3 hospitals. He had never heard those words used before except once, in a mandatory training 7 years ago, delivered by a woman in civilian clothes who had explained, in the careful way that people explain things that are technically classified but practically necessary, that there was a protocol, rare, almost never invoked, that existed for situations where a patient had a background that meant the standard medical approach required immediate consultation from personnel with specific knowledge. A protocol that could be invoked by any healthcare worker who knew the code. A protocol that meant, I know something that changes everything. Step aside. He dropped his arm. He stepped aside. Maya walked through the door. What happened in the next 4 minutes was something that everyone in that room would describe differently afterward, because what people describe is always shaped by what they were looking at, and what they were looking at depended on where they were standing and what they were able to see. What Dr. Chun would describe, a nurse entering the room and immediately, without asking permission, correcting the dosage calculation on the amiodarone with 2 spoken numbers, then moving to the bedside and placing 2 fingers on the patient's wrist in a location he had been taught was for pulse measurement, but that she held with a quality of attention that was not about pulse. What Priya, who had followed to the doorway, would describe, Maya moving through that room the way water moves through a system it understands, finding gaps, filling them, anticipating the next step before the current one completed. No wasted motion. No hesitation. The economy of someone who has performed under pressure so many times that the performance itself has become as automatic as breathing. What Carolyn would describe, the sound of Maya's voice, which had changed. Not dramatically, not theatrically, but it had dropped 1 register and stripped itself of every softness that it carried during normal shifts. The voice that came out during those 4 minutes was a different instrument. Clear, direct, the kind of voice that rooms obey. What Daniel would describe, standing back and watching and understanding, for the first time and with complete certainty, that he had no idea who he had been managing for the past 14 months. And what Colonel Whitfield would describe, later, much later, was the specific moment when she reached the bedside. She placed her hand over his on the bed rail. Not clinically, deliberately. She said, very quietly, so only he could hear it. I've got you, Colonel. You're not doing this alone. Something in his face, the jaw, the set of it, the held against everything quality of it, gave way. Not collapsed. Released. The monitors continued their chaos. The room continued its organized panic. And Maya Reeves stood at that bedside and worked. It was Elaine who asked. She arrived at 7:02, 5 minutes after she should have, Because traffic had been wrong that evening in the specific way that life is sometimes wrong on the specific evenings when you cannot afford it. And she arrived to a hallway that was no longer in full crisis, but that still carried the atmosphere of crisis, the aftermath of it, the way a room holds the shape of a storm that has passed. A nurse she didn't recognize, Priya, met her before she reached the door and walked her to a chair in the family waiting area and told her that her father had experienced a serious arrhythmia and that it had been managed and that he was stable now and that the doctor would come speak with her shortly. Who managed it? Elaine asked. Priya paused. There was a nurse, she said. Another pause. She was incredible. Elaine looked past her toward room 412. Through the glass, she could see her father. He was sitting up, actually sitting up, with the head of his bed raised, and his face had a quality she had not seen in 3 days. A settled quality. The quality of a man who has come through something and landed on the other side. And beside him, writing something in his chart, was a woman in scrubs. Her name is Maya, Priya said. In the family consultation room, 40 minutes later, it was Dr. Harmon who delivered the medical explanation. He was thorough. He was clear. He credited the team. When Elaine pressed, when she asked specifically what had been different, what had changed, what exactly had happened, Harmon paused in a way that was unusual for him. Your father has a particular cardiac profile, he said carefully. There were variables in his case that required a specialized approach. What kind of variables? He set down his pen. He looked at her with the expression of a man choosing his words around something larger than the words. You should ask the nurse, he said. Maya Reeves. I think she'll be better able to explain certain aspects than I am. It was an extraordinary thing for Raymond Harmon to say. Elaine found her in the hallway 20 minutes later. The conversation that followed would remain, for everyone who heard secondhand accounts of it, one of the stranger human moments the unit had witnessed. Maya listened to Elaine's questions, the careful ones, the grateful ones, the one underneath all the others, and she was quiet for a moment. Then she said, Why don't you sit down? They sat in the family waiting room, which was empty at that hour, and Maya folded her hands and she looked at Elaine with eyes that had, in the 40 minutes since the crisis, become again the calm, measured eyes of the nurse that most of the floor believed was the entirety of who she was. Your father was in the Special Forces, Maya said. Army. 3 deployments. The last one was in conditions that did specific things to his autonomic nervous system that most cardiologists aren't looking for unless they know to look. Elaine was very still. I know to look, Maya said. Because I spent 8 years as a combat medic, Maya said. Attached to special operations units in 2 conflict zones and 1 location that doesn't have an official name on any document I'm authorized to discuss. I got out 7 years ago. I went back to school. I got my RN. And I took this position because I wanted to do this work in a context where, most days, the stakes are lower. She said the last part with something in her eyes that was almost humor. Almost. Most days, Elaine repeated. Most days. Elaine looked at her for a long moment. The code you used. To get past the charge nurse. Sierra. It's a real protocol, Maya said. Used when a patient has a background that affects their clinical picture in ways that require immediate specialized input. I shouldn't have needed to use it on this floor. Your father's file should have been flagged. It wasn't. A pause. I noticed things over 3 days that told me who he was. I was waiting for the moment where it mattered. You saved his life. Maya looked at her hands. I used what I know. How did he know? Elaine asked. That you? The hand signal, Maya said. Old communication method. Used in environments where you can't speak and you need to identify someone as friendly. Elaine pressed her hands together. He told me he slept better last night than he had in years. He said he couldn't explain why. Maya nodded. I think he could explain why. He just may not want to. She stood. He should rest, she said. And she walked back toward the floor. And Priya, who had been at the station and had watched the entire exchange without being close enough to hear it, saw Maya return to the desk and pick up her chart and continue exactly as she always did. But Priya also saw Daniel Precht walk to Maya's side. She saw him say something. She saw Maya look at him. She saw him extend his hand. And she saw Maya shake it. At 7:40 p.m., Maya walked back into room 412. The room had been cleared. The crash cart was gone. The monitors had settled to a steady, measured conversation, the sound of a heart that had been pulled back from the edge and was now, cautiously, holding its ground. Colonel Whitfield was awake. He looked at her. You identified yourself, he said. You gave me the signal first. I didn't know if you'd know it. I know it. He was quiet for a moment. The specific quiet of a man reassessing something fundamental. How long, he asked. 8 years. Attached to the 75th mostly. One rotation with a unit I won't name. He nodded slowly. The nod of recognition between people who have been to places that don't appear on maps. You're a nurse now, he said. I'm a nurse now, she agreed. Good nurse. She considered this with the absolute seriousness he'd intended it with. Yes, she said. I am. He almost smiled. The side of his mouth moved. The dose that kid was about to give me would have compounded the arrhythmia given your specific autonomic profile. Stress response from 3 combat deployments changes the way the heart handles certain antiarrhythmics. It's not in the standard literature, not in a way most cardiologists encounter. But you encountered it. 3 times, she said. In the field. We lost one. We didn't lose the other 2. He looked at the ceiling for a moment. I've got a brown lab named Sergeant, he said. I know. You told me 2 nights ago. He looked back at her. I'm going home to him. Yes, she said. You are. She adjusted his foreline. She checked his monitoring leads with the practiced efficiency of someone who has done it 10,000 times and still does it as carefully as the first. She moved toward the door. Nurse, he said. She stopped. He looked at her with the eyes of someone who has spent a career reading other people and knows when reading is complete. Thank you, he said. 2 words, said with the weight of someone who does not say them lightly. Maya held his gaze for exactly 1 second. Rest, she said. And she closed the door softly behind her. By the end of that week, the floor had quiet-lipped 0PPPP rearranged itself around a new understanding. Dr. Harmon began including Maya in rounds. Not as a formality, as a participant. He asked her questions, and he listened to her answers, and the medical team shifted, almost imperceptibly, to reflect a more honest picture of what the knowledge in that unit actually looked like. Daniel Precht updated the supplemental flagging protocol for patients with special operations backgrounds. He did it without announcement. He just did it. Priya started arriving 40 minutes early instead of her usual 5. Lauren, the night nurse with 22 years of experience, told a colleague that he had always known there was something different about Maya Reeves. She carries things, he said, but quietly. You can tell with people who carry things quietly. They've had practice. On Thursday morning, Colonel Whitfield went home. He stopped at the nurse's station on the way out. He found Maya. He placed something on the desk in front of her without speaking. It was a photograph, printed small. A brown Labrador in afternoon light, ears up, impossibly alive. On the back, in an old soldier's handwriting. For the ones who show up when it matters. Maya turned the photograph over. She looked at it for a long time. Then she placed it in her badge holder, face out, where she would see it every shift. Some people carry their heroism in medals and citations. Some carry it in the quiet knowledge of what they did, and what it cost, and the choice to keep showing up anyway. Here is what I want you to think about. There are people in ordinary jobs, all around you, carrying extraordinary histories. The nurse, the firefighter, the quiet stranger who stepped in when things went wrong. Have you ever been helped by someone who turned out to be so much more than you expected? Tell me in the comments. I want to hear your story.